Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and Mirz Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Nun Hey Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn the very complex Siman Lamed Beis, the manufacture of tefillin. We begin today on the very bottom line of Nun Daled Amid Beis, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Mem Gimel. Chritz Shel Shin Dahainu Chuda Lamata. The chritz, the form of the shin, and we are speaking specifically about the point of the shin at its bottom. So we've got the shin on the bias, and at the base, at the very base, the shin comes to a point, trying to get it into the lighting in a way that you could see it. Okay, there we go. So you can see here at the bottom, the shin comes to a point. That point, says the Mechaber, has to reach all the way down to the Tviris, all the way down to the Makam Hatvar. It has to reach all the way down to the bottom. Chritz shel shin dainu chuda lamata, the point at the bottom. Yagia ad makayim hatefer. It has to reach all the way to the titura where the stitches are. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Kut Sadugvav shel shin. This is the point of the shin on the side of the bias shel roish. Bein the yamin ubein the smile. This applies to the right-handed shin as well as to the left-handed shin. Both of them have a point at the bottom that has to reach all the way down to the bottom of the side wall of the bias where it reaches the titura. It has to reach all the way down to the titura. But b'diavad it is kosher even if it does not reach the titura. Kol sheyesh tzuras hashin alav. B'diavad, as long as we have the form of a shin, it's kosher, even if it does not reach down to the titura. Now we go to Nun Hey Amid Aleph, says the Ramah Haggah. V'chein, similarly, hayud shebeshin, the yud of the shin. Now when we speak about the yud of the shin, we mean the leg of the shin, right? The leg of the shin. It starts out as a yud. The leg of the shin, says the Ramah, tzarech liga lamata bishulei hashin. The yud of the shin, the leg of the shin, catch the light there, has to reach all the way down to the base. So imagine if this was cut over here, and the yud, this yud of the shin did not reach all the way down to the bias, to the base, that would be a problem. It has to reach all the way down to the bottom, to the base of the shin. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Kuf Tzadik Ches hayud shebeshin. Yesh be'agdoilin shemachalkin bein shin hayamini lahasmali. There are those gedolim that say that in the context of this halacha, there is a difference between the shin which is on the right of the wearer, that's the shin that has 3 legs, and the one on the left that has 4. Yesh me'agdolim shemachalkin bein shin hayamini lahasmali shebesmali, and they say that on the left-hand shin, the one with 4 yudin on top, Adarabba, quite the opposite, Yedaktek shelo yigwa yudin b'shulei hashin lamata. They say that on the 4 yudid shin, actually it would be preferable if the yudin would not reach down all the way to the base. Rather, they should be cut and they should not reach all the way down to the base. Ubasmali, and when it comes to the left one, be'inon sheshnei hayudin, that the 2 center yudin, the 2 side ones, yu noigin lamata b'shuleha, that the 2 side ones should reach the base, but the 2 middle ones should not. And if we have time, at the end of the shir, I'll explain why, and that will also shed some light on the origin of this very strange shin, this shin with 4 tops. I'm sorry, I skipped. That we should make no chilik between the one on the right and the one on the left. And even on the left one, we say that all the yudin, even the 2 centered ones, should meet the bottom. I think I read this wrong, so let me just go back for a second. Basically, what we said is like this. The Mechaber told us that the upper yudin of the shin have to reach the base. The reason they have to reach the base, let's skip for a second to Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Kuf Tzadik Tes, Liga Lamata, the Balavachi Ein Shem Shin Olav, because a shin is not a shin unless the yudin touch the base. So the default halacha would be that if you're making a shin, the tops of the shin must connect to the base because that's what makes it a shin. And therefore says the Mishnah Berurah that even b'di'evet, if the yudin of the shin do not touch the base, it's puzzle. Ubashmin hashin hasmali, when it comes to the left-handed shin that has 4 yudin, im echad negeya ve'echad eino negeya, if one is touching and one is not puzzle, it would be puzzle v'ayin b'bir halacha. Now, in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Kuf Tzam Ches, the Mishnah Berurah brought down that there are gdolim that say that there's a chilik between the one on the right and the one on the left. What would the chilik be? The chilik would be that the one on the left that has 4 yudin on top, there are those that say that the 2 center yudin should not make contact with the base. The Magen Avram says we paskin not that way, and even the 2 center ones should make contact with the base. V'chein kasav a pri begadim, v'chein royal lasos, v'chein kasav birka Yosef, b'shem mahariya in sham, v'chein pasku shari akroinim. Oid kasav a pri begadim, the yirishia ala shinin tzuras yudin, loy kavin pshutin ba'alma. And he brings down here from the Pri Megadim that when we make the shin on the tefillin, we should make sure that the upper legs of the shin are formed like yudin, not that they're just straight lines. Okay. Now we go weiter in the Ramah. Says the Ramah near the end of the top line. V'lo yimshoich hashin harbe. We should not make the shin too long. And what he means by this is, we should see to it to end the shin at its bottom, at the bottom of the bias. We should not make it overly long so that it descends beneath the titura. And I'll explain what that means. Let me just see if there's a Mishnah Berurah here. Well, let's finish reading the Ramah. You shouldn't make the shin too long. We want the very bottom of the shin to be visible at the titura. Now, our tefillin are made out of or echad, which means that the bias, the ketzitza up here, is made out of the same piece of leather as the titura. So what they do is they take kind of one big sheet of leather, they use a press, and they form the 4 bottom over on one side of the sheet of leather. Then the other side they fold underneath, and that is what becomes the titura. So all of this, the ketzitza, the titura, the mabarta, and remember the titura is folded in half, right? That's why it's stitched closed. This is all made out of one sheet of leather. So if I would open these stitches, I could unfold the titura out here, and you would see this is all one big piece of leather. But doesn't really have to be made that way. The bias and the titura could be made out of 2 separate pieces of leather. Now, how would you do that? So I took the little plastic box that covers the shel rosh, right? Let's imagine that this is the ketzitza. So here we have a ketzitza without a titura. Now I want to add on to the tefillin a titura. So what do? I take a flat piece of leather, right? I take a flat piece of leather and I cut a hole in the flat piece of leather the size of the base of the ketzitza, right? Now I take the ketzitza and I insert it into the hole that of the sheet of leather that is going to be the titura. And what they would actually do is, at the base of the ketzitza, they would make flaps of leather on all 4 sides, and this bias would go into the hole of the piece of leather that's going to be the titura, and the flaps would extend underneath the titura, underneath the top of the titura, and then when you flap the titura closed and stitch it down, you're trapping the base of the ketzitza inside the bias. So again, here you would have, imagine you would have just the titura and the mabarta without the bias on top. And then this would be the bias. You would insert the bias into the hole of the titura. the flaps would go underneath the titura on all four sides, and then you'd stitch it closed and stitch everything together. Now, if you imagine doing that, then you could understand if on the ketzitza I made the shin too long, so that now the point of the shin is going to be submerged inside the titura. That's the problem that the Mechaber is referring to, the Ramah. He's saying, don't make the shin too long so that the base of the shin is now submerged inside the titura. Ela, rather, shegam shulei hashin yehenira al hatefer, rather, even the very bottom of the shin should be visible above the titura at the point of the tefiros. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut and reish, shegam shulei hashin. Ritzaino loymar, what he means to say when he says the shulei hashin, the floor of the shin, ratzaloymer chudehen shel hashinin. He means the points of the bottom points of the two shinin. Vatam. And the reason why this is important is the tzarich sheyeh kol hashin nireh, because the entire shin, even the very bottom, has to be visible. Why? Ulekayim, because this comes to fulfill Madiksiv, what is written in the pasuk, V'ro'u kol amei ha'aretz, that all of the nations of the world will see, Ki shem Hashem nikra alecha, that the shame of Hashem, the name of Hashem, is upon you. V'amar Rabbi Elazar, what do you mean that the shame of Hashem is on you? So Rabbi Elazar says, Elu tefillin shebarosh. This is a reference to the tefillin sharosh, Shem Hashem nikra. The first letter of Shem is a Shin. The first letter of the name of Hashem is a Yud, Yud Ke Vav Ke. And the first letter of Nikra is a Nun. So it's Rosh Tevis Shin. Rosh Tevis Shin. Ubediyeved, however, Bediyeved, Im Nichnas Ma'oitl Ma'at L'Soicha Titura, if just a little bit of the bottom of the Shin is submerged in the Titura, Ad She'en Loi Al Yedei Zeh Tmuna Shin Karoi, if enough of it is submerged, that you no longer have the basic shape of a shin, tzarich iyun, you would have to see if you would be yaitza. V'ayin be'bir halacha, he sends us to the bir halacha dibur hamaschel shegam shulei hashin. Ayin b'Mishnah Berurah in Yediyeved, he tells us here in the bir halacha, take a look in the Mishnah Berurah, where I said b'Diyeved, if you don't have the basic shape of a shin because the bottom of the shin is submerged in the titura, b'Diyeved, are you yaitza or not? In the Sefer Avodas Hayom, he says it's mashma that there's no need to be machmir. But the Chavetz Chaim says I don't know what the source of that is. But perhaps Humayri, the Sefer Avodas Hayom is talking about a case where a little bit of the bottom of the shin is submerged in the titura, but you have enough of the base of the shin that you still have the basic shape of a shin. It's only a tiny bit of the point that's submerged in the titura. I think that should say titura. Gam hu moide. But if really the base of the shin would be submerged in the titura, so you lost the shape of the shin, then even the Avodas Hayom would be moide that you're not yoitzev at tzarich iyun, and he says he remains at a tzarich iyun. Okay. Now we go to, I just want to wrap up over here, Sif Mem Gimel. What's the takeaway of the Sif Mem Gimel? We have to have the shin on the outside of the bias of the Shel Rosh. The shin, lechatchil, is supposed to go all the way down to the Makam HaTefer, all the way down to the Titura. We should, if it's not made out of Ar Echad, you see, if the tefillin are made out of Ar Echad like ours, then the point of the shin at the bottom cannot be submerged in the Titura, because it's all one continual piece of leather. But if, like I described before, the ketzitza is made out of one piece of leather and the titura is made out of a separate piece of leather, so that the bias goes down into the titura, then theoretically the base could be submerged in the titura. The Mechaber says that is not proper. It's supposed to be fully visible. B'di'eved, it depends how much of the shin is covered. If enough of the shin is covered, let's say it was covered up to here, now you don't have a base, so you don't have the tmuna of a shin. You don't have the shape of a shin. That would be a problem. The Mishnah Berurah bleibt in the tzarich iyun. What if, let's say, it's submerged up to here? So you do have a base, and you do have the shape of a shin, but you're missing the bottom. Is that problematic or not? On that he says tzarich iyun. Second line down in the Shulchan Aruch Sif Mem Daled. Titura de Tfilin halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Mechaber over here paskins like the Rishonim that say that the fact that the bias needs a titura, and by that he means a base that folds closed and covers up the bottom opening of the bias, that's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. V'hainu, and this means sheyasim or lamata, that there has to be leather underneath. You should place leather underneath lechasois pi habatim, to close up what would otherwise be an opening at the bottom of the bias. Here would be a bias without a titura. You have an opening on the bottom, so there's got to be leather closing up the bottom of the bias. That's the titura. That is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, says the Mechaber. Why is it called a titura? Explains the Mechaber. V'nira ke'en daf shel gesher. In its appearance, it looks like the plank of a bridge, hanikra titora, which was called a titora. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Reish Aleph, sheyosim. The Mechaber says we should place a piece of leather at the bottom of the bias to close up the opening at the base of the bias. The implication of that is that you had a bias which was one piece, it was open. Now you're going to take a separate piece of leather and you're going to put it on to make a closure. The implication of that is that it's two separate pieces of leather. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, sheyasim va'afilu l'das ha'soivrim da'abatim tzrichim liyos kula meyarachad mamish. Even those who hold that the bias, the ketzitza itself, must be made out of one piece of hide, that's true of the ketzitza, but the ketzitza with the titura with the mabarta doesn't all have to be made out of one piece of hide. Even if the titura is made out of a separate piece of hide, the tefillin are still kosher. And that's why the Mechaber could write that we're taking a separate piece of leather and placing it on the opening. Nevertheless, if it's possible, toiv lahader gam bazeh, it would be good to be mahader lotzei stas hamachmirin bazeh, to fulfill the opinion of those who are machmir and hold that even the titura and the mabarta should be made out of one piece of hide together with the bias. V'ayin bebir halacha for greater detail. Continues the Mechaber 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down. Ma'abarta de tefillin halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The ma'abarta, the part of the bias that the ritzua passes through, this piece up here, is also a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. V'hainu she'or hatitura, the hide that makes up the titura, yehei oroich mitzad echad, it should be long in one direction. It should be long so that it protrudes out on the back to make a mabarta. In the words of the Mechaber, it should be aruch b'tzad echad. It should be long on one side. V'yasa baya mabarta, and use that extra length to form the mabarta. Ketzad, what should you do? Yachtechenu b'shnei atztadim, and we've already spoken about this many times. You see, his problem is like this. I just told you that on one side the titura should be long. Well, if one side of the titura is longer than the other side, then it's not merubah, right? It's a rectangle. How do you make it merubah? So here is where the Mechaber says, what you do is, yachtechenu b'shnei tztadim, cut it, notch it on the two sides. Shaloi tehe rechava k'may roichav hatitura. You cut into it, notch into it here and here. And then on the interior of those notches, the width. So the width from the inside of the notch to the inside of the notch, right? Now, this is not equal to one leg of the square of the titura. And by doing that, says the Mechaber, Kedei shi'eh nikar ribua hatitura. That makes the ribua of the titura recognizable, because now we understand that this is the fourth side of the square of the titura. By virtue of making this notch, of notching that in, that's how we delineate the fourth side of the square. Uba'isa ma'abarta, and now inside that ma'abarta, Iveris haritzua, the ritzua passes through the ma'abarta, V'al shem kach nikra ma'abarta, and that's why it is called a ma'abarta. Gam b'tfilin shel yad yes atitura u'ma'abarta, the tefillin of the shel yad, the bias of the shel yad, also has to have a titura and a ma'abarta. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan, Reish Aleph, Sheyasim, no, we did that already. Reish Beis, Yehei Aroich, the titura should be longer in one direction so that you create a ma'abarta. V'im nifsika, if the part of the titura that becomes the ma'abarta splits off from the rest of the titura, mutar l'tafra, you could stitch it back on. Ois Katan Reish Gimel, you make the notches, sheyehei nicker, so that it should be recognizable which part of the titura is the titura that needs ribua. Kigama titura tzricha midin liyos beruba, because halacha l'moshe b'sinai requires that the titura also has to have ribua. U'kamoshe kesavnu l'mayla b'sif lamites. Okay, let's go a little bit weiter. Says the Mechaber 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from the bottom. Now you're up to the point where you're going to insert the parshias into the bottom. Says the Mechaber, Yegalgal kol parsha misoifa l'tchilasa. You take each one of the parshas of the tefillin and you roll it, like you roll up a mezuzah sort of, and you roll it from its end to its beginning, so that if somebody would come and open up the roll, they would open right away to the beginning and they could start reading right away. Not that they have to roll it to the end. Yegalgal kol parsha misoifa l'tchilasa. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Reish Daled misoifa l'tchilasa. When you're ready to put it into the bias, Kemay mezuzah, this is similar to a mezuzah, shenigleles, that you roll it up, me echad klape shema. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem echad, going from right to left. Now you roll it from left to right, so that when you open it, you start right away by Shema. If you would roll it from right to left, when you open it, you're opening it to echad, you have to roll it back in order to get to Shema. Don't do it the other way. Continues the Mechaber. Again, 5 lines up from the bottom. After you roll up the parsha, v'karcham, you then wrap the parsha beklaf katan, in a small piece of klaf. You take a small thin piece of parchment and you wrap it around the parsha. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Reish Hey v'karcham, you wrap it. This requirement to wrap the parsha in a small piece of cloth is only lechatchila. Avalam loy karcham kasher b'diavad. If you did not wrap it, it is still kasher b'diavad. Imein loyacherim, if you do not have other tefillin. V'ayin b'machzah shekel u'bebiar halacha. Ois Katan Reish Vav, you wrap it b'klaf katan. If you don't have cloth, you only have a piece of cloth, you could use a piece of cloth made like cloth. V'ayin b'biar hagra. Says Mishnah Berurah weiter. Says the Mechaber weiter, 5th line from the bottom, last word. V'yesh makpidin milakarcham elo b'klaf kosher. There are those who are makpid that piece of cloth that you use to wrap the parsha has to be the cloth of a kosher animal. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Reish Zayin, b'klaf kosher, it's saying loymar, avaloy mi behema v'chaya temeya, but you can't use a non-kosher species of behema or chaya. Avo b'matlis, but if you want to use a cloth, gam l'deyazu shapir dummy. Even according to this opinion that says that you should wrap it in a cloth of a behema tahira, yes, if you're using cloth, it has to come from a behema tahira. But if you're not using cloth, if you're using cloth, you could use cloth. If you're using cloth, I'm going to have to break over here, so we're going to end off 4 lines up off the bottom by the Ois Katan Reish Ches for the Mishnah Berurah. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The discussion of Liman HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua Sefuas and Parnasa, Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be Zocher to see the BS Tzedek, B'meher v'yameinu, Amen. Be well.